Great. Thank you, Richard. And hello, everyone, and welcome. This is a thrill to be a part of this group. And I'm looking forward to not only today, but for the series of 3 sessions in episode or season 1, as Richard described it, as well as season 2 and beyond. So I'll try to be quick here today, but by way of introduction to what I'm going to try to do here, in preparing for this session, I was really kind of torn between trying to offer kind of a TED Talk-like presentation. It was just mentioned in the initial invite. I was like, okay, wow, I'm putting together a TED Talk for this group. And that didn't quite sound right. So I said, no, that's not it. Or just putting together a traditional academic research presentation. But given the nature of what we're trying to do here, that didn't feel quite right either. So where I landed was on something kind of in between that's neither of the above. And as a result, may meet no one's expectations, but it's what I put together and hopefully it'll serve some value. And I will say that I'm largely, hopefully in this session or in my presentation, setting some context and not going as deep on some things in terms of some of the specific empirical research studies as I might otherwise, because I know that following me today is going to be Angie Passarelli, who will go deeper on some of the specific studies that I'll be alluding to at a high level. Now, we really all know in this area, in this field, that people often struggle to make sustained change in their lives. It's hard, right? Hence the role and utility of coaching. We know coaches play a key role in helping people do just that. And we each, drawing on the various definitions in the field, have our own way that we describe or define coaching. Well, we tend to describe it or define it as a facilitative or helping relationship with the purpose of achieving some type of change, learning, or new level of individual or organizational performance. Right? Well, the question then becomes, just how then do coaches help others change in sustained ways? How does it happen? So as Richard framed this topic for today, we're really going to be thinking about the process and the mechanisms of coaching. Well, when you look at the ICF definition of coaching, ICF defines coaching as partnering with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process, right, that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. Now, other credentialing bodies, CCE, WABC, EMCC, and others have offered, perhaps slightly different definitions of what coaching is, but certainly very similar definitions. Well, back in 2012, Tony Grant offered that all of these definitions indicate that the process of coaching is essentially about helping individuals regulate and direct their interpersonal and intrapersonal resources in order to create purposeful and positive change in their personal or business lives. So from there, I think we can see that from a definitional perspective, from a purpose perspective, there's general consensus around what that broader purpose and process is of coaching. However, there are a variety of specific approaches and or mechanisms that coaches employ to help their clients achieve desired outcomes. Just running through just quickly, and this is not by any means an exhaustive list, nor is it mutually exclusive, as you think about some of these potential mechanisms that people have written about. Eric DeHaan and colleagues have written quite a bit over the years about the importance of and methods of building the coaching relationship and how that plays a role. Others have talked about and written about the use of feedback, right, and the role that the coach should play in kind of providing clients with feedback of various forms or from various sources. David Drake has written quite a bit about over the years the use of stories, right, or working with narratives in helping clients kind of learn and grow through coaching. Others have written about kind of the physicality of coaching and kind of being aware of the body and using the body as a mechanism to help clients in the coaching process through embodied presence or somatic coaching. Yet others have focused on the importance of being aware of emotions in coaching, truly working with the client's emotions, and or going beyond that, really leveraging emotions in the coaching process to drive desired outcomes. And then if you think about some of the work coming out of the University of Sydney and the coaching psychology, they really focus quite a bit on the psychomechanics of coaching. In other words, self-reflection, self-insight, well-being, and solution-focused approaches as key mechanisms to driving desired outcomes. Well, where I'm going to land today is on our approach and some of the mechanisms that we focused on here at the Weatherhead School at Case Western Reserve University. And this approach ties in and really kind of blends a number of the other mechanisms that I quickly went through there. Here, we really focus on leveraging Richard Boyatzis' intentional change theory and the work done by Richard and a number of other colleagues, myself included here at Case, or people who've come through here, as well as the neuroscience of change. And again, that work has been led, a lot of the neuroscience work by Tony Jack and colleagues, but others who have joined forces in really learning what we can from cognitive neuroscience and how that impacts not only the change process, but coaching in particular. Now, drawing on all this is an approach that we call coaching with compassion. Now, this approach to coaching draws on mechanisms to help a person or an individual being coached make progress on their intentional change efforts, right? Their efforts toward making truly sustained, desired change in their lives. Boyatzis and colleagues, or myself included again, have distinguished this from what we've referred to as coaching for compliance, right? Or coaching a person to some externally defined objective. And I'll talk in just a moment about what we've found through some of the research to be distinctions in these approaches and the resulting outcomes. Now, I will say before I move on that the coaching with compassion, as we describe it, has also been referred to in various research and other studies and writings as coaching for sustained desired change. It's been written about and talked about as coaching to the positive emotional attractor, which I'll talk about in just a moment here. Or Angie Passarelli, who's coming up here shortly, has written about it and studied it as vision-based coaching. And it's also been studied and written about as ICT, or intentional change theory-based coaching. And now all of these different forms that have been written about and studied still really fall under this umbrella of what we're calling coaching with compassion. And now 3 key principles of coaching with compassion that really are kind of embedded within each of those other approaches that I just shared are leveraging the power of positive emotion and recognizing how to leverage the tension between positive and negative emotion to facilitate change. Focusing on dreams, not just goals. And that's a key piece that we've found to be important in this coaching with compassion approach. So it's not just about goal setting and attainment of goals, but it's anchoring that or embedding that within the context of a broader set of dreams or personal vision. And then finally, focused on building resonant coaching relationships. So recognizing that the coaching relationship does indeed matter. Now, all 3 of these principles really flow from Boyatzis' intentional change theory. And if you're not familiar with intentional change theory, I know many of you on this session or in this meeting are, but it recognizes that significant behavioral change is not necessarily a smooth linear process where you start at your starting point and smoothly progress to your end point of change, but instead significant behavioral change, according to the theory, occurs more in bursts or spurts that are labeled as epiphanies or discoveries. And what the theory suggests is that there are 5 of these bursts or spurts or epiphanies that need to occur for individuals to make sustained desired change. That starts with the discovery of one's ideal self, who one really wants to be and what they really want to do, and then progresses to a discovery of the real self, who one is today in an absolute, not just in an absolute sense, but who one is today relative to that defined ideal. And there are strengths, areas in which an individual is already in alignment between their real self and ideal self. But for most people, there are also gaps, areas where that real self and ideal self are not necessarily in sync or in alignment. That discovery then leads to the third discovery, which is the creation of a learning agenda or a plan to move the real self to where it is more closely aligned to the ideal, but this starts with, first of all, recognizing and then leveraging and building upon strengths, and then turning to closing any gaps that may exist. This is done through the fourth discovery, through the experimentation with and then practicing of new behaviors, again, to move a person closer to that desired end state or outcome. And finally, in the middle of all this is the recognition that significant behavior change is hard, as we know, and it's going to be more successful and likely if one does it within a network of trusting, supportive relationships. So building resonant relationships with others to help one travel through this change process. Now, so this theory of intentional change works at multiple levels, works as individual change, works at dyadic level, teams, groups, communities, and any kind of level of abstraction, but applied to the coaching practice or process. What happens is the coach is embedded within this fifth discovery in this change process and essentially kind of helps a client travel through each of the 5 discoveries. Now, a driver for, and what much of the research that's been done around this model and really what makes it work derives from complexity theory and recognizes that there are positive and negative emotional attractors into which we might be drawn. And these things and these attractors have an impact on our ability to truly change and learn and grow. Now, within the positive emotional attractor, what's experienced is positive emotion, parasympathetic nervous system arousal. So an individual is more relaxed. Their peripheral vision is kind of at its maximum. They're actually capable in this state of making new neural connections and truly learning, growing, and changing in meaningful ways. Also, what happens within this positive emotional attractor is that from a neural network activation perspective, it's the empathic network that's activated. So individuals are more open to thinking creatively and being open to others and new ideas as they think about change. Now, in the negative emotional attractor, on the other hand, what's happening is from an emotional experience is they experience more of negative emotions. And from a neuroendocrine arousal perspective, it's the sympathetic nervous system that's more aroused. So the stress response. So individuals tighten up, blood flows from the brain to the large muscles in the body. So thinking is not as clear. You lose that capacity to truly make new neural connections and learn and grow and change in meaningful ways. And from a neural network activation perspective, it's the analytic network that's activated. So the focus is more on immediate, task performance or problem solving or solutions, as opposed to thinking more widely and openly about creative possibilities. So literally in this state, individuals are less capable of making change and learning as individuals are achieving that desired outcome ultimately in coaching, when they're embedded or anchored in that negative emotional attractor state. Now, this is not rigorous research here with, some, sophisticated methods and statistical analysis, but this that I'm going to share with you has yielded interesting insight nonetheless. And it has informed other research that we have been done and has been more rigorous. And now an exercise that we've conducted for many years is an exercise called Who Helped Me? And in that exercise, we ask individuals to think about someone who has truly helped them become the person they are today, truly helped them in their lives, right? And then to think about a particular moment when that person helped them. And then so we give them worksheets and have them think about this. So they write down the person and then the moment they really helped them. And then we also ask them to think about, well, what did they say or do, right, in that moment that was so helpful? And importantly, how did it make you feel, right, as you think about it? And what made it so helpful? And then we've often collected this exercise or these results in the context of a broader experience. So they also have been exposed to intentional change theory. So we asked them to jot down or note which phase of the intentional change process was triggered as well by that person. And then a second half of that exercise, we asked them to also think about, after they've captured moments from a number of people who have truly helped them, we asked them to think about, okay, now think about who has tried to help you over the course of your life and career, but perhaps wasn't as successful, right? So they tried to help, they meant well, but maybe it didn't really help. And then do the same thing. What were some moments you experienced? What did they say or do? How did it make you feel? You know, what stages or phases of the intentional change process were triggered by that? And we collected that data. So we collected over a period of time all of these results, and something interesting emerged. So when we looked at what happened when people said that someone truly helped them, 80% of the time, or approximately 80% of the time, what was triggered was that positive emotional attractor and what they shared. About 20% of the time, it was a negative emotional attractor that was triggered. Again, so not 100% of the time, but 80% of the time, when individuals looked and thought about who really helped them in their lives, what they did put them in the zone of that positive emotional attractor. Now, interestingly, when you look at what individuals shared when they talked about who tried to help them, but maybe didn't, only 35% of the time did what that individual actually did to with them, put them in the zone of that positive emotional attractor. About 65% of the time, what that person did triggered the negative emotional attractor or the NEA instead, right? So 65% of the time. And this is interesting because I think it really explains to us or triggers some thought in terms of future research possibilities, which we've been followed up on. Is it's no wonder why so many efforts to help people change often fail, because many of the efforts that people are taking, meaning well, instead of really helping a person, they trigger that negative emotional attractor that puts them in that state where they're physiologically less capable of changing, learning, or growing. So many things often that including coaches, if they're not careful, might do are intended to be for good and to help an individual with the desired outcomes, but actually block the process instead. So a theoretical model we developed, and we put this forth back in 2012, that pulls a lot of this together, suggests that coaching with compassion, as we described it, really positively influences the experience or the triggering of the positive emotional attractor, which results in greater positive than negative emotion being experienced, as well as greater parasympathetic nervous system than sympathetic nervous system arousal. What's not depicted here in the model that we put forth in 2012, but that is part of this as well, is that it also activates the empathic network, we argue. And all of these things then lead to a variety of outcomes. Primarily, what we focused on the most is sustained desired change in the individual, right? But also the positive outcomes related to physical health and personal well-being. Now, coaching for compliance, that other piece that I haven't talked a lot about, but when you instead trigger that negative emotional attractor, helping people think about problems or as opposed to possibilities, for instance, negative emotions are more likely to be experienced. It's the sympathetic nervous system that's more highly aroused. And again, not depicted, but also within this coaching for compliance and the negative emotional attractor, it's the analytic network that's more likely to be activated. And these things, we argue, are going to be negative related to sustained desired change, as well as physical health and personal well-being. And then we've done a number of studies that kind of look at different parts of this model, if you will. Up in the upper right-hand corner, we also talked about things where we haven't done quite as much research. We've done some investigation and looking at this, but not as much research. But I think it's an opportunity, and that's what I'll get into as I wrap up my time here, is opportunities for future research and other ideas. But what that represents are when you have coaching with compassion that's taking place within an organizational context. So you have managers and leaders in organizations who begin to coach with compassion and truly create a culture of coaching with compassion in the organization. We argue that you're likely to see outcomes that are meaningful to the organization, such as organizational commitment of individuals, greater pro-social behavior, so organizational citizenship behavior, as well as higher quality connections amongst individuals in the organization. And I think it's important for future research that we begin to examine more outcomes such as these, because these are things that are truly meaningful and valuable to organizations. And it's organizations who are often, in the context of leadership development today and coaching today, paying for the coaching that many of our clients are experiencing. And they're often looking for, what's that payout? What's that benefit? what's the ROI? Well, I think beginning to explore more of these outcomes such as this will help in that regard. So quickly, yield my time here. Ideas or questions for future research, just a few, just thought starters about research or future research in this space. So my colleagues have done quite a bit of work on this coaching with compassion and coaching to positive emotional attractor versus negative emotional attractor using fMRI research, which has been fabulous and has yielded, tremendous insight in terms of the process. However, fMRI research, as you may know, is very time consuming, it's very expensive, it's very invasive. So I guess one question is, what are some more potentially less invasive ways of examining the physiological effects of coaching with compassion and coaching for compliance? Now, we do have colleagues who have looked at other ways of doing this. Angie Passarelli in her work has used some other means. Anita Howard has done similar. But I think we still have a ways to go in coming up with ways of gathering this data that are truly less invasive and more affordable. Along those lines, you can ask what methods might be used to simultaneously measure these physiological effects, or things like heart rate variability, for instance, for both the coach and the person being coached or the client during a coaching conversation. Again, I think there is technology, there are methods of doing this, but again, to my knowledge, the things that I've seen are still pretty invasive. So it kind of detracts from the coaching conversation when you're all wired up and trying to do these things. So what methods might we be able to develop to kind of gather some of this physiological data in a very unintrusive way, such that it doesn't really detract from the coaching conversation and what's actually happening, and that allows us to really observe the dance of the coaching conversation between the coach and the client and see in the moment what's happening when the coach does this to the client, et cetera, and vice versa. Also, we've written quite a bit about over the years this distinction between coaching with compassion and coaching for compliance, and we've measured it in various ways. But we've never actually developed behavioral scales for these two forms of coaching. And I think doing so would open up the doors for a number of other investigations that can be conducted much more readily, just using kind of behavioral scales than some of the other techniques we've been using to measure these ways of coaching currently. Along those lines, it might help us further the research to really begin to determine, are coaching with compassion and coaching for compliance necessarily opposing approaches? We have often written about and talked about them in that way: coaching with compassion versus coaching for compliance, good versus evil. And part of that is for emphasis, because we feel that there is an opportunity for more coaching with compassion, and the clients would benefit more if coaches and managers and leaders who do coaching would begin to think about that form of coaching more. But I think the question is, do they necessarily have to be opposite ends of the same continuum or spectrum? And I don't know that we know that for sure, and I don't think that that necessarily has to be the case. And along those lines, to what extent might coaching with compassion and coaching for compliance be used together to create sustained desired change for individuals? And under what circumstances? As well, under what conditions might one be more effective than the other? Again, we're strong proponents of coaching with compassion, but under what conditions might coaching for client compliance actually be a way to more effectively reach desired outcomes for clients? I think there's also an opportunity for additional work on the dosage and sequencing effects of coaching to the positive emotional attractor versus the negative emotional attractor. We've done some work in that area, but I think there's room for a lot of additional work to see more and to build more of a body of work around that specific dosage and sequencing lines of thinking, if you will, in terms of what really makes a difference. I talked about the mechanisms. I shared kind of the work going on and at the folks in Sydney in the coaching psychology unit. But to me, an interesting area to further explore would be what are the areas of convergence and divergence between intentional change theory-based coaching, or ICT-based coaching, and solution-focused cognitive behavioral coaching that has been focused on by the folks at the coaching psychology unit at Sydney. Shortly before he passed away, we had the opportunity, and several people on this call were in this session, to put together a session for the Academy of Management, where Tony Grant was one of the participants, and again, several people on this call were. But we, among other things, kind of put on the same stage Richard Boyatzis to talk about all the years of work on intentional change theory and what that has led to in terms of knowledge about desired outcomes, and Tony Grant to talk about all the work coming out of Sydney around solution-focused cognitive behavioral coaching. It was an interesting display, a very useful conversation. And I think we started to have some discussion about, well, we should be talking more and blending that work. Unfortunately, Tony passed away and then COVID hit. So we really haven't advanced and moved forward on that. But as Richard said, you have these pockets of work being done all over the world, you kind of within these bubbles. What might we do to begin to kind of merge these bubbles more and cross-pollinate some of this work and learn from one another and learn kind of what some of the things we're doing are in alignment, and then teasing out some of the differences and what we might learn from those differences. And then finally, and this, I wanted to put this in there because Richard wanted to make sure that we address this as well. There's an opportunity for a comprehensive empirical examination of coach competencies that yield positive change in client outcomes. There still has not been a definitive research study comprehensively done that truly distinguishes and measures effective coach competencies, right? Now, there obviously are competency models that have been established and that we're working off of. But if you look at the work that was done to truly establish the competency movement, and Richard Boyatzis is one of the founding fathers of the competency movement, in '82, his book, he suggested that for something to be a competency, it must be empirically tested or validated against performance or some desired outcome variable. It must be a specific behavior of a person, and it must actually distinguish outstanding performance versus average or poor performance, right, in the research. Now, we still don't have a study that's been conducted that truly teases that out for coaches, right? The work hasn't been done. Now, we have competency models, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, and Richard has talked about this for quite some time, but many of the things that we're talking about or calling competencies are not always competencies. Sometimes they're skills or job tasks or, some other things, but we still have work to do to really fully flush out an empirically validated coach competency model. Now, along those lines and Richard, I'll let you chime in here. So we have, if you'd like, so we'd like your help, or like to at least pull out a call for assistance, for help with the coaching competency study that we've had up and running. We're still gathering participants for this study, and it's been a slow go, unfortunately. But it's an aggressive study. So we really want to do what's really necessary to create a validated coach competency model. Richard, I don't know if you want to kind of jump in and kind of share what really is required. You're the principal investigator and you've been making this appeal, so I'll give you a chance to make an appeal to the group in a convincing way to hopefully get us some more participants.